All right. And we're continuing on through Genesis. And it seems like kind of the theme for today is about God having his way. And that kind of goes into what we're talking about. As I've often shared with you, and frankly, I think we've often experienced, God works in each of us in his own timing, not in ours. And this is because he has a plan for each of us in his service. But his plan for you may not match up with what he has in mind for the person sitting next to you. Okay? One thing that I can tell you that is a sure certainty of ministry is one size does not fit all. Not all of us are going to be working the computer. Not all of us are going to be teaching. Not all of us are going to be working in children's ministry. Not all of us are going to be cleaning toilets. It really doesn't matter. One size does not fit all. And we see in the Gospels how Jesus dealt with each individual person when he ministered to them, including his own disciples. He treated Peter differently than he treated John. And, it was a one-on-one ministry. He dealt with the woman at the well in a totally different way than he dealt with Nicodemus, but yet the message was still the same, the message of salvation. God works through us as individuals because we are created the way he wants us to be. Okay, no, God never made mistakes. And like any master craftsman, he molds us in a way that works best for us, even if we're not sure exactly what that means. Okay? Now, I don't like talking about myself a lot, but I do want to demonstrate this point through my own path to ministry. Okay? God took his time to make sure that he laid my path down before me the way he wanted it, taking into account who I was, and even when I never saw it, and I had no idea to what end that path was being laid. As many of you have heard, Lisa likes saying this, I never had a desire to be a pastor, and frankly, I never wanted to live where it snowed. Okay? So, my plans. Well, I went to college. I majored in geophysics. Sounds brainy. Well, yeah, it was hard. But I was interested in earthquakes, so I wanted to study them. And so here I am in college. And as a senior at the University of California in Riverside, I was planning on going on to work for the oil industry because that was where the money was. I was thinking about, I want to support myself and eventually a family. Now, at the time, the girlfriend I had decided she wanted to take what was called the CBEST, the California Basic Education Skills Test. Now, this is a test that normally, if you're going to be a teacher, this is the test you take. Well, because she was doing it, why not? I'll do it. Did I want to be a teacher? Well, wasn't against it, but it didn't really appeal to me. I wanted to work in the oil patch. That was the whole point. My thought was to have this test in case I needed a backup if my plan A did not pan out. God's thought was, you're going to be a teacher. Now, for a couple of years after graduation, that was during the mid-'80s recession and oil glut, oil company jobs were not to be found, and I was jumping around from different jobs that frankly had nothing to do with my major. I mean, I was a computer programmer, I was a geotechnical technician, all these high fancy jobs that, to be honest, sounded good and paid the bills until I got laid off because of the recession that was going on. But I ended up being a substitute teacher, which only required a bachelor's degree and, the CBEST. What a fortunate coincidence. Now, again, my thought, I'm going to use this job to pay the bills until a real job came along. God's thought was, welcome to your new career. I realized as a sub, and at the time, I made a whopping $72 a day, which back then, it really wasn't that bad, but there's no benefits, nothing. I realized I really couldn't make it financially because in the summer, you didn't work. So, but I also discovered, the teaching isn't too bad. No, I don't really enjoy teaching 7th graders. I didn't mind 8th grade, and certainly high school wasn't bad at all. And no, I could not make it as a kindergarten teacher. Subbing, I got to experience the whole gambit. And, hey, this is pretty good. And I was still applying for real jobs even during this process. And the weird one was a position as a naturalist, a ranger naturalist over at Capitol Reef National Park. They really actually wanted to hire me, but something happened, and that didn't happen the way that we wanted it. But in the meantime, I went ahead. I decided, well, let's get the teaching credential. And a couple of other fortunate coincidences. My chosen major in college, that geophysics major that sounded so brainy, fast-tracked me into the state credentialing program without having to take any tests. At the time, it was the NTE, the National Teacher Examination. I didn't have to take it. Oh, you're in already. And 2 years of subbing. I was able to go in as an intern, as a student teacher. So I got paid for my student teaching instead of having to work for free. Wow, lucky me. Another coincidence. Wow. Now, of course, this leads me up to here. The next 25, at that point, by 5 years into it, I realized, okay, I'm in it for the long haul. The school I happened to teach at in the mid-1990s just happened to be where I met my wife, Alicia. Okay, another coincidence. And soon thereafter, I got involved in ministry for the first time, doing sound and media. And soon after that, both of us felt the call for Utah. This is, early 2000s. And after a whole series of fortunate coincidences, many more than we have time for, God opened the doors, and here we are. A pastor where it snows. And we're here to stay. We love it. Now, I will confess, I often wondered what would have happened if I had known God's plan from the very beginning. So instead of going to UC Riverside, after high school, I went to Bible college. And so instead of waiting 33 years, I when it would go into ministry at 22. Okay? And by the time, it seems like, well, I could have actually spent all those years working in the ministry, doing God's will, doing who knows what, and maybe it would have been easier if I had done that. Well, I can't change the past, but again, let's look at God's plan. Would it have been easier? Okay? Now, during those 33 years, I went through a lot of experiences that really made me into who I am today. Okay, I lost a wife to cancer in 1995. My dad died, and 1997, my mom died 2021. And I, have beautiful kids and so forth. But would I have been the same person if none of these had happened to me? Because I would have gotten married. That's was always a plan I had, but I would not have married whom I did marry. Okay. I probably would have had kids, but not the kids that I have now. And I'd probably be in ministry at this point still, maybe thinking about retiring, but maybe not, because I would not have had the same financial backing that I have now. Church doesn't pay me. I get paid by the state of California's teacher retirement system and now Social Security. Okay? If I had not been a teacher, that would have not been there. You see, this was God's timing. This is what He wanted. And as I learned from all these experiences, He brought me through. Even at the worst times during those 33 years, He made me into the man He wanted me to be today. That's who I am. Now, you may ask, what has this got to do with Joseph? Well, I'm sure Joseph maybe felt the same way. Now, for him, the delay from dream to fulfillment was only 20 years, but so much had happened to him, making him into the man God wanted him to be. Now, while it was true that Joseph's father, Jacob, had been grooming him for a leadership role in the family, as we saw, it wasn't going to end well unless the son did some serious growing up. And that was not likely to happen as long as he stayed home. And as we saw, being sold as a slave by his own brothers, being falsely accused of rape by a woman who was essentially trying to rape him, mercifully landing in jail instead of being executed, and then being forgotten in jail for 2 years, well, all this caused Joseph to grow up and mature pretty definitely, especially when he saw that God blessed him and gave him favor in the eyes of his masters, even in prison. He was no ordinary prisoner. He was suddenly like the second in command in the prison. No, he still couldn't go where he wanted, but he didn't have to worry about being beaten or anything like that. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead, turn back to Genesis chapter 41. Okay, we're going to be starting in verse 53. If you need Bibles, we have some over here, or use your phone. That's okay with me. I know if people during service had their phones out, I trust them not to be scrolling through Facebook. Now, as we saw last time in Genesis 41, Pharaoh had a couple of very disturbing dreams that featured cannibalistic cows and heads of grain. Yeah, that would be very disturbing in my mind, too. Now, nobody among the experts in Egypt were able to interpret these dreams until Pharaoh's cupbearer, his butler, remembered that when he had been in prison 2 years before, he had also had a very weird dream, which had been accurately interpreted by Joseph, who was this man who had been serving in the prison. So the butler told Pharaoh about Joseph, and very quickly, Joseph's fortunes changed. He cleaned up real fast, and now was standing before the royal person, and now was listening to Pharaoh's dreams. Now these dreams, they're very similar. The first was about 7 fat cows grazing next to the Nile, who were then accosted and devoured by 7 skinny cows, who had remained completely unchanged despite gorging themselves on a very disturbing meal. And in the second dream, the same thing happened, except instead of cows, the dreams featured heads of grain, the fat, healthy heads being eaten by the skinny, unhealthy heads. So Joseph's listening to this dream, and then he gives the interpretation. This was a prediction of what was going to happen for the next 14 years. No, not a prediction, a foretelling. This is what's going to happen. There are going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine's going to be so bad that we are not even going to remember what the 7 years of plenty were like. It's a horrible famine. So Joseph then took another step. He suggested a plan to prepare for the famine by appointing an official to be in charge of the harvest, to collect 1/5 of the current harvests and to store them as a reserve for when the famine came. Then, when the harvests had either declined or were non-existent, Egypt would still be able to eat off that reserve. And what was left over could then be sold to all the countries around Egypt, who are also going to be affected by the famine. And this had a side benefit of adding a little extra money into the Pharaoh's coffers. Okay? Now, Pharaoh and his advisors were so impressed by Joseph and his suggestion that, Pharaoh decided he was going to form a committee to investigate the issue and come up with a series of recommendations. And then, of course, we know that's not what happened. By the time they came to a decision, the famine would have already been over 14 years later. No, we know better. Pharaoh knew that he had to act decisively. As we saw last week, Egyptian history was filled with examples of civil unrest and government coups and what have you, pharaohs being killed and disposed when food ran short and nobody knew what to do. Okay? So Joseph, who had been a slave and a prisoner, was now appointed to be second in command to Pharaoh in charge of Egypt, essentially his grand vizier. And Joseph got to work right away. He didn't sit there and say, wow, how lucky I am, and gloat with it. It's like, I got a job to do. During those first 7 years, he was in charge. They harvested everything. 1/5 of it got put away in storage. If they didn't have enough storage, they built more storage for it. And soon they had put away so much that they lost count of the amount. There's just too much there, but that was okay. Hey, we're going to need this later. And during those 7 years, Joseph got married and he had 2 sons. Now, those 7 years flew by. Everything going according to plan. Then, as predicted, the famine began. Let's read Genesis chapter 41, starting in verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, do." The famine was all over the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. Okay, let's stop there. Now, there are no details really given here on what happened, but we can read between the lines pretty easily based on what we know about the Nile River's influence on Egyptian agriculture. Now, famine in Egypt. The Nile always ran. Nile never went dry. Okay? Famine in Egypt meant that every year when the Nile flooded, well, either it didn't happen or it didn't cover its usual extent of farmland. Because this flooding was important, it recharged the soil with nutrients and kept that part of Egypt extremely fertile, because the soil that was underneath was essentially desert sand, and that's unsuitable for growing anything. Okay? So if the floods didn't happen, the soil began to be depleted of those nutrients, and it was a slow process. The people could still grow crops, but each year the harvest was going to be less and less until a good portion of the land, basically the stuff that was furthest away from the Nile, because it was reclaimed desert, well, it would eventually become infertile and would not grow anything. And in these verses, we see this progression until the people realized that they couldn't feed themselves. And as expected, they went to their local governors that were appointed by Pharaoh, and instead of leaving empty-handed, as had happened in the past, they were able to buy grain for themselves for bread. And of course, they did have other foods. They had fish in the river. They had animals still they could eat. But the bread was their mainstay of their diet. So we couldn't grow enough. Okay, can we get some extra? Sure, here you go. And we don't know the process that they distributed, how much it cost. That's one of those things we never found out, lost to history. And the plan worked like a charm. No one in Egypt went hungry, so there was no rioting, there was no coup against the government. Everything ran smoothly, and as was foreseen, there was enough grain to be sold to the surrounding countries that were hit hard by that same famine. And so far, everything was working well, and I would be willing to bet that Joseph was extremely popular among the Egyptians for his policies. Cool. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, let's move on to chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So Jacob, we're back down with Joseph's father Jacob. And as we have seen, he had a very large extended family, and he had many servants, he had many flocks, he had many herds. So as the famine continued, it was becoming more and more difficult to keep everybody fed and healthy. Now, I'm certain that it was very common knowledge that there was grain in Egypt, but the way it says here in the text, you can tell the brothers for some reason didn't talk about it. And they knew as well as their father that they were running short on food, but they acted like they were kind of oblivious to it. And Jacob noticed this attitude, and he asked them, "Why do you keep staring at each other?" I mean, he was very blunt. Why did they? You might want to ask that question yourself. Well, why didn't they talk about it? Why didn't they offer to go down to Egypt to purchase food without being asked? I mean, there's a disaster. We see it happening. Why are you doing nothing about it? And there were probably several reasons or excuses, mostly from baseless fears. Okay? Now, one reason/excuse, depending on how you look at it, the trip to Egypt was long and dangerous. It was about a 250 to 300 mile trip each way. And so a round trip could consume 6 weeks' time. And given the widespread famine, even though Egypt was pretty stable, elsewhere may not be so safe. People would be likely to attack strangers crossing through their land, especially if they happen to be carrying food. But if you need food, that's the risk you're going to have to take. I mean, even after arriving in Egypt, the men couldn't be certain of a friendly reception. At that point, the Egyptians in Canaan were kind of looked at as a lot more cruel and barbaric than they actually were. They felt that, well, we're foreigners, we're going to be vulnerable, and they might arrest us and turn us into slaves. And that was a baseless fear. For as we've seen, the Egyptians were friendly to merchants from Canaan. They know why they're there. Sure, you want to buy some grain? We're more than happy to sell it to you. You got the money, we got the goods. Okay? And it was true that the Egyptians did look down on foreigners simply because they had a little superiority complex. Oh yeah, we're Egyptians, we're better than you, but we're more than happy to take your money. Okay? That's not even an issue. So these brothers are fearing that, something could happen to us. And if something happens to us, what's going to happen with our families? And Dad, what's going to happen with him? He's getting up there in age. But there's also one more possibility. Maybe the memory of selling their innocent brother into slavery in Egypt, maybe this memory is haunting them right now. Now, it'd been over 20 years since they'd done the deed, and I'm pretty certain by now they were convinced that Joseph was dead. But as we will soon see, they obviously hadn't forgotten about it. A guilty conscience does have a way of digging up the past and arousing doubts and fears within us, as if we expect at some point to be punished for our actions. Okay? And maybe they figured, well, if we're going down there, maybe we're going to be punished because of what we did. But whatever the case, Jacob, as we saw, wasn't particularly polite to them. He was leader of the family, so he had to make the executive decision to send all the brothers to Egypt to purchase food, with the notable exception of Benjamin. Now, we've looked at this business in the family before. We see once again Jacob dividing his family between the sons. He's still playing favorites. Now, unlike what some people believe, and this is something you see in Sunday school and so forth, he did not hold back Benjamin because Benjamin was this young kid that might get into trouble. No, Benjamin was 21 now. He is basically an adult, and he was fully capable of joining his brothers on such a trip and pulling his fair share of the work needed to transport all this grain back home. And Jacob didn't even say, well, no, I need Benjamin to stay here to take care of me. I mean, it was, this would be a reasonable suggestion, considering Jacob was 128 at this point. But Jacob was quite healthy. Okay, it says nothing else in there about him being in bad health, unlike his father Isaac, who basically kind of decayed until he died a few years before, about 8 years before, and Isaac was 180. Okay. Now, granted, Scripture doesn't say that Jacob was grooming Benjamin to become the new family leader, as he had done with Joseph. Maybe he had learned his lesson about being too obvious about his favoritism, but the favoritism was still there. Okay? After what had happened to Joseph, Jacob was probably a little wary of his other sons. Maybe they had something to do with Joseph disappearing. So he felt, I'm going to keep Benjamin safe at home. And why? Well, with Joseph gone, Jacob's youngest son was his only living link to his favorite wife, Rachel, who had died, and the old father wasn't about to lose the second of his two sons. Well, whatever the misgivings the brothers may have had, off they go. They went down to Egypt, and they were in good company because, again, the famine was everywhere around there, so they were just 10 people among thousands of random faces in the crowd. So as they're going along, they're thinking, well, maybe there isn't any trouble ahead. So they thought. Let's continue on. Verse 6. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered his dreams, which he had dreamed about them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." But he said to them, "No, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this matter you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother. Then you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." So he put them all together in prison 3 days. Stop there. So as basically the head honcho, the Grand Vizier of Egypt, Joseph was a very busy man, and he didn't take part in every individual grain transaction. As the food supply was stored in several cities, he had delegated the task to the commissioners assisting him, but he likely made his way from place to place to make sure that everything was running smoothly. So no doubt the Egyptian residents, who were citizens, were provided for in a routine manner. Again, we don't know how, but it was pretty simple. But the foreigners, on the other hand, had to be screened somewhat carefully, lest they were spies sent by rival powers that may have been considering an invasion of the land. Okay, why would they do such a thing? Well, Egypt was now the breadbasket of that part of the world, so some other power might make some desperate attempt to seize the Egyptian food supplies, and the Egyptians thought this was a very possible scenario. Practical paranoia, perhaps, but whether or not it was a real threat, honestly, I doubt it, because the Egyptians had the food, and they had their army, and their army was strong and well-fed, while the other powers were not. They were dependent upon Egypt for that food. So there probably was no invasion in the offing, but they were still a little paranoid about it. And so that's why they were questioning him and accusing them of being spies. It was just a fortunate coincidence, shall we say, that Joseph just happened to be on hand when his 10 brothers arrived on the scene to buy grain, and among the thousands in the crowd, he recognized them. Okay? Now, on the brothers' part, it was highly unlikely that they expected to meet Joseph. And even if they did, the 10 men wouldn't have recognized him. He was 17 when they sold him into slavery, and 20 years had passed. He would change radically in appearance. Okay? Whereas they changed a little, maybe a little gray hair here and there, maybe a longer beard, but they would still be recognizable. This is why he spotted them. Oh, yeah, there's Judah. Oh, there's Reuben. There. Oh, wow, the gang's all here. Cool. Okay? And also, being an Egyptian official, he had to dress the part. He was clean-shaven, and he dressed like an Egyptian, and he spoke to them in the Egyptian language. Perfect Egyptian. And he spoke to them through an interpreter, okay? And if you really think about it for a minute, how could his brothers have guessed that their mouthy little brat of a brother was now a high government official in Egypt? It probably never even crossed their minds. So Joseph's standing there. These 10 men are bowing before him, and he's seeing, oh, those dreams I had back when I was a kid. Hey, they're starting to come to pass. But the dreams had 11 brothers and my parents. Now, he knew his mother was dead, but where was Benjamin? He knows Benjamin's not here. Where was the other brother? And where was the father? He had to know. And to be honest, he's talking to these guys, And it's difficult a lot of times when you're in an emotional situation to kind of control your voice. And as many people did, Joseph decided to disguise his emotions by speaking harshly. You're spies. What are you doing here? What are you, and he's knowing that, hey, these dreams aren't true yet, but I need to know what's going on with the family. And, he had this curiosity, and so he questioned them, and they gave him the information. Oh, yeah, no, our dad, he's at home with our younger brother. Yeah, there were 12 of us, one's dead, but the other, they're okay, they're alive and well. And he's thinking, some people may say, well, why didn't he admit who he was and spoke to them in Hebrew? Well, he was testing them too. Have you guys changed? Have you actually grown up? I mean, you hated my guts enough, you were going to kill me. Now I'm down here. The dreams are coming true. What's your position? What are you feeling right now? They had to face their sins, and they had to come to a place of honest confession. And that was going to take some time. And the time wasn't right yet. So, despite the fact, and we've talked about this, that the Egyptians were normally pretty tolerant of Canaanites and Semites because they traded with them all the time. Joseph's brothers didn't know this because, they listened to their own propaganda. And Joseph said, okay, we're going to play off this fear. He knew he was taught that himself, so he knew exactly what they were thinking. So he accused them 4 times of being there in Egypt under false pretenses, of being spies. And each time their brothers affirmed, no, we're innocent. We're true men. And he willingly gave information about their family. And, I'm curious how Joseph reacted when they mentioned about a brother that was no more. But I'm sure it's like, oh, good. Benjamin's still alive. Dad's still alive. Okay, so let's try a test. He's sitting here thinking, let's test you. He gave him an opportunity to prove that their story was true. Okay, he said, go ahead and send one of your number back to Canaan and have him bring Benjamin back to Egypt, whereas the rest of you are going to stay in prison until Benjamin gets here, and then I can prove that your story is true. Now, if you think this through, if the brothers weren't so stressed with fear, they might have noted that Joseph was subtly showing his hand. This test was a hint that the Egyptian official would recognize Benjamin when he saw him. Because otherwise, the brothers, all they needed to do was go back to Canaan and bring someone back, maybe one of their own kids who are about Benjamin's age, and the Egyptians wouldn't know the difference. But Joseph would. And that's not Benjamin, that's your son. And this official, he's questioning them about their father and their brother. And again, another hint that he had more than a passing interest in the family. I mean, a normal Egyptian grand vizier, someone in Joseph's position, honestly would not be interested in a foreign family's makeup or even their welfare. Okay? He had enough on his plate to keep him occupied. So Joseph said, this is what you're going to do. And I'm sure they're sitting here thinking, oh, great, this is exactly what we thought was going to happen. So he put them in confinement for 3 days. And honestly, it was just to teach them what it was like to be prisoners and to give them time to think. Let them stew it over a little bit. Now, the Hebrew word translated here as prison in verse 17 probably should be better rendered as in custody. And this would be closer to the original context. Though the brothers were only confined under guard, essentially under house arrest, it brought about a realization that God was dealing with them because of what had happened 20 years earlier. And we see this in verse 18. Then Joseph said to them the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house. But you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, Did I not speak to you, saying, Do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them and again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Stopping there. So at the end of 3 days, Joseph apparently had a change of heart. He actually just changed the test. He would only keep one brother as a hostage, while all the others returned home to get Benjamin and bring him back to Egypt. Now Joseph, this was not an unreasonable expectation. Joseph knew that they were going to have to return to Egypt for more grain at some point, and they would be forced to bring Benjamin with them or else go hungry. And I would say it's possible that Joseph even was aware of why Benjamin had not come with him. He knew his dad was possessive. Furthermore, it was much safer for a group of men to travel than for only 2 men to make the journey. And the men did have a lot of grain they had to carry. The ominous statement, though, here's an interesting point. You shall not die, in verse 20. There was a hidden double meaning, which Joseph knew was going to be grossly misinterpreted. Okay? The brothers thought, you shall not die. Bring him back and you won't die, otherwise you're going to die. But Joseph knew better. He says, well, no, if you don't come back, it's referring to their starvation if they didn't return to Egypt for more food. You're going to die if you don't come back. And I'm sure this part of it didn't even cross their minds. They were worried about their own skin. And there was even a subtle hint that the brother held hostage might be executed if they did not return. Now, Joseph had no intention of doing so, but the brothers didn't know that. And then, without knowing that Joseph could understand them, they started discussing their predicament. And they started bringing up past. Oh, man, he was pleading with us. He was crying. He was a teenager. When we tossed him into that pit, I mean, remember how we took it? We just sat down and had a meal afterwards, you know. And Reuben didn't solve the problem. He basically said, I told you so. You know, I told you not to do it. But in this statement, he supplied another piece of the puzzle to Joseph. It reminded them all of his kindness in trying to rescue Joseph in the first place. And it was possible that Joseph may not have been aware of this plan of his older brother. Okay? But Reuben assumed that Joseph was dead. He's saying, hey, we are now to answer for his blood. Yeah, he's dead now. We screwed it up. Now what comes around goes around. We're getting it now. And Joseph, he's listening to all this. The emotions are starting to come to the surface, so he leaves the room and he weeps privately. And this is the first of 6 such experiences we're going to read. And he had learned a lot about the brothers as they freely talked. They thought he didn't understand them, and that obviously the interpreter wasn't saying anything. So he figured, okay, he's listening and he's thinking, okay, you guys did learn something. Your hearts are softening indeed. And again, this is interesting. There are a couple more subtle hints of who this rough official is. First, his statement, for I fear God, and he used the Hebrew name Elohim. Now, we take this for granted today. You know, when someone talks about God, we automatically assume, oh yeah, the God, God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh. Okay, but back then, Yahweh was viewed in the world as a tribal deity, certainly not widespread. No one but a Hebrew or someone who was closely associated with Hebrews would have known about God, let alone know his name, Elohim. Okay? This by itself, if the brothers had thought about it, this alone pointed to Joseph. This guy's Joseph. He's talking about Elohim. He's talking about God. Oh, man, he must know Joseph in some way. They didn't think that. They were, again, worried about their own skin. And the second hint, instead of sending him back empty-handed, he said, no, go away. I don't want your family to starve. Get your grain, pack it up, and get on out of here. And the more people available to help with the transport of the food, the better off they were. But you still got to bring Benjamin back. He wanted to be able to reconcile with the whole family at once, not just 10 of them. He had God's assurance that all 11 brothers were going to bow to him, but he wanted to motivate his brothers to act and to do what was right. So by keeping Simeon as a hostage, Joseph also kind of managed to replicate the situation when they had sold him to the Midianites and then went home without him. You're going home without one of your brothers. How does that feel? Not someone you hated, someone you essentially loved. You know, maybe there was another test here. Maybe he's thinking, hey, maybe they're going to try to bribe me and exchange, just like they exchanged cash for the Midianites. Maybe he was expecting, well, if we bribe you, will you let him go? They didn't do that. Okay? The brothers apparently sensed it. They saw what was happening, and their guilty consciences prompted them to see that divine judgment was on the way. It was already in their predicament, and they were now starting to talk about it. They were trying to face and confess their sin. This had not been mentioned previously. One other thing, why Simeon? Why did he pick out Simeon as a hostage when under normal circumstances the firstborn was the one who should be taken hostage, and that would have been Reuben? Okay? We don't know. Bible doesn't tell us, but we can speculate. Maybe Joseph was honoring Reuben's attempt to rescue him. Oh, you tried to help me. Okay, I'm not going to take you. But Simeon, well, he's the second born, so he'd be the next logical choice. A while back, though, I think a more likely reason, a while back, we talked about this, that Simeon may have been the ringleader in the plot to kill Joseph in the first place. And he was known to be a cruel man. He had that reputation, and maybe Joseph hoped to teach him a lesson in mercy. No, you're coming. And I'm sure he's thinking, oh, great, here it comes. Though it's likely that Simeon was also treated well, he's under house arrest, he was still used to living out of doors among the flocks and moving about as he wished. So confinement, even in the most luxurious quarters, was still a horrible fate for someone who was used to moving around. Okay? Now, it's worth noting that Joseph's plans were not in revenge for how his brothers had once treated him, but they were to show how in God's word the guilt of the brothers came back on them and called for justice. And in fact, Joseph was now going to show all of them even more mercy. Let's move on, verse 25. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. But as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money has been restored. There it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is this that God has done to us? Then they went to Jacob, their father in the land of Canaan, and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is the Lord of the land spoke roughly to us, and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men, we are not spies, we are 12 brothers, sons of our father, one is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me, take food for the famine of your households, and be gone. And bring your youngest brother to me, so I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Then it happened as they emptied their sacks, that surprisingly each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. But Jacob their father said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me. Let's stop there for a second. So, as they're preparing for the trip home, going back to Egypt, Joseph graciously and unexpectedly provided extra provisions for their journey. Normally, this would have not have happened. They would have been eating out of the grain that they had already purchased in Egypt. And it probably, honestly, they weren't too happy about leaving Simeon behind, but they were pretty certain, well, okay, we'll be back. We're going to need more grain at some point, and we're going to be able to bring Benjamin with them, and that will take care of the problem. Okay? Now, Joseph, aside from giving them extra provisions, which again was very generous and totally unnecessary, Joseph had some other surprises in store. He had his steward restore the money they had paid for the grain. Now, at this time, foreigners did not use money or currency as we know it. Now, the Egyptians did have coinage, but the money that the brothers had were pieces of silver of set weights. Okay, in fact, we've read about it before earlier in Genesis about, 30 shekels or this. A shekel was a unit of weight. And so they're basically little pieces of silver that had a standard weight set. And so when they're paying for food, they say, this is 20 pieces of silver. Okay, here you go, 20 pieces, and so on. And Jacob, he could afford it. Okay, this wasn't even an issue. They weren't they weren't broke. But some scholars think that Joseph paid for the grain himself so that he could care for his father and the relatives he hadn't seen in 20 years. This would be pretty consistent with Joseph's personality and his family views. But the money in the sacks, well, that was another part of his test for his brothers. Were they going to pocket the money, or were they going to bring it back as honest men, as they claim to be, would do? Now, I need to very quickly mention here there is a contradiction alert. You're thinking, what? You're kidding me. Yeah. There appears to be an inconsistency in the story. Now, it says one brother found the silver in his sack at their first encampment, and the assumption is that all the men must have searched through their sacks and found the rest of the silver. And we're going to see in the next chapter, we're not going to see it today, that's the story they gave to Joseph's steward. Hey, here's the money. We found it at the first encampment. But then it goes on and says, that they were surprised when they got home and saw the money in their sacks. And if they discovered it at the encampment, why were they surprised and frightened when they opened their sacks upon arriving home? You see a little inconsistency there. Now, some people, it's a contradiction. Well, no. I mean, some scholars, to try to justify this, say that the account they gave to the steward in chapter 44, that was merely or chapter 43, excuse me, that was the Reader's Digest version of what had happened. Well, maybe, but I don't think so. It really didn't make any difference where they found it. The fact was they found it. And it said specifically it was at the encampment and not at home. And they had no reason, this is probably true, but there was no reason for them to lie to the steward because they needed this guy for help. And it's not like they were caught with the money and trying to explain, well, this is how we got it. They were trying to return the money. We have no clue what got here, but we're giving it back to you. This is what we owe you. What happened? No, we don't know. I mean, there's no unified view. Scholars are all over the place with possible solutions, but it's all speculation. Okay? We're not going to go into a lot of them. The fact of the matter is, unlike most of the contradictions, quote unquote, that we come across, there is an easy way to explain through them because, no, it's not a contradiction. You just have to take other factors involved. And that's not the case here. We honestly don't know. I don't think they were trying to deceive their father. Oh, they found it, and then they acted surprised when they got home. Why? They didn't steal it. It goes back to that. They didn't steal it. And to be honest, Jacob wasn't all that upset about it. Again, we're going to see in chapter 43, he's thinking, probably was a mistake. Don't worry about it. I mean, that's kind of, just take the money back. Everything's fine. But there's no explanation that accounts for all the different points. It's not a contradiction. The brothers were obviously surprised by their find, no matter where it happened. And more importantly, there are no doctrinal issues here. The experience put fear and perplexity into the hearts of the brothers because they were asking, what's God doing? Why did he do this to us? And they knew they were innocent concerning the money, but now they're worried, well, how are we going to convince the Egyptians of this? They already had a rather bad experience. Well, if someone decides we did steal the money, there's not much we can say about it because we got it. We can tell whatever story they want. They don't have to believe us. So, enough of that. So now they're back with their dad. They told him exactly what had happened, and Jacob did not take the news very well. Okay, it actually made him feel worse since he heard about Simeon being confined. And what, you want to take Benjamin too? You're robbing me of all my children, that's essentially what he said. And again, this is a hint that he suspected that his older sons were behind Joseph's disappearance. He said, I don't know. I think you're guilty, but hey, you're robbing me of them all. Everything is going against me, he's wailing. And that may have been a valid statement from a human point of view, but as we can see, looking at it, everything that was happening was working for Jacob's good and not for his harm. Now, it's really sad. Jacob is still expressing his special love for Joseph and Benjamin, and this really, and we've talked about this really must have hurt the other sons. And in fact, it did lead to Joseph's being sold into slavery. But what we see also is the old man is living in the past, and he's ignoring what the rest of his sons were doing at that moment. I mean, they just made the trip down to Egypt to help preserve the family. A simple thank you probably would have been nice, okay? Was it their fault that they had an overbearing Egyptian officer asking so many personal questions? Was it their fault that they were called spies? Was it their fault that Simeon was arrested? Were they responsible for the money that was in their bags? I mean, Jacob should have been more understanding. But sadly, he was still grieving the loss of Joseph from 20 years ago. Okay? And he felt that the loss of Simeon and the possible loss of Benjamin, well, no, this is more I can bear. And we see a lost opportunity here. This whole episode should have led Jacob and his sons to do some soul searching and confessing of sin. It didn't happen. It would have been a good time for all of them to have sought the Lord and pray for his help and his direction. Okay? They didn't. But despite of this, God was still at work and his purposes were going to be fulfilled. Now, usually, we haven't heard much from Jacob's older sons in a way of a respectful response to some discourteous statement made by their father. Because, to be honest, he's somewhat insulting here. But this time, one of the boys did respond. Verse 37. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, I will bring him back to you. But he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Ooh, that's harsh. In 2 ways, okay? First off, as we read, Reuben was out of favor with his father. Remember, he had a fling with one of his father's concubines. So Reuben really was not the one who should have spoke up. He probably should have kept quiet. But because he was the firstborn, I guess he thought that maybe I should act like a leader, okay? Unfortunately, this was a case of it is better to be silent and thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Because Reuben's suggestion was ridiculous. What right did he have to offer his sons' lives as compensation for the loss of Benjamin? I mean, did he discuss this with his wife and his sons? Because we're not talking about little boys now. He's the oldest, so their sons are probably about Benjamin's age, maybe a little bit older. We don't know. Okay? How would this, how is this going to make it any better? Was Reuben offering to sacrifice one son for Joseph and the other for Benjamin? And of course, we know this isn't how God commands his people to operate. And Jacob knew it as well. I will say that for him. But it was an obvious example of Jacob's failure as a father and spiritual mentor, though he probably would have denied it, because Reuben would never have made such a suggestion if he knew the ways of the Lord. And Jacob, he outright rejected Reuben's suggestion, and rightly so. It wasn't the right thing to do. But then he ignored the motivations behind the suggestion, and he once more split the family in two deliberately. My son will not go down with you. So notice, you guys are not my sons. My son, Benjamin here, will not go down with you. His brother, as if he had no other brothers, his brother Joseph is dead, and he is all I have left. He acted like they were not even related, okay? And he soundly rejected any suggestion that appeared to threaten Benjamin's safety, okay? This was and his statement, oh, Benjamin alone is left of Rachel's two sons. He's all I have left. This was a selfish statement, and it rubbed it in the face of the other brothers that they were second-class members of the family. And it didn't matter. It didn't seem to matter to Jacob if Simeon was free or not. Jacob was okay with the loss to Simeon, apparently. He was still carrying on about Joseph after 20 years. And what he didn't realize, but this selfish position was liable to lead to destruction for all of them. Not just Simeon, but for all of them. He's saying Benjamin must be preserved even if the whole family starves. A crisis doesn't make a man, but it shows what a man is made of. And Jacob was revealing his true colors as a man who places his own desires above his God-given responsibilities. And the sad thing, at this point, he doesn't seem to care. So on that note, we're going to stop for now. Now, it's amazing how short-sighted some believers can be. Now, remember, Jacob was not a pagan. He was a believer. He had made confessions of faith to the Lord earlier in life. And so a lot of believers will do the same thing. It's amazing how short-sighted some believers can be when they refuse to look beyond their own desires. Because what happens? They refuse to see what God has in store for them, and they often neglect their own needs simply because they don't line up with their wants. Now, because they don't have what they want, they focus on what they don't have instead of giving God the glory for what he has given to them. Okay? Well, I don't have a Mercedes-Benz. Yeah, but you have a Jeep. And it runs. Okay? What's the problem? Well, that's not what I want. No, but what do you have? Okay? At some point, God's going to withdraw his blessing in order to give such a person a warning to get their attention, and then they will be given a choice. Focus on what you have. Let God deal with what he wants in your life in his timing, or face losing everything. Okay? You can't lose your salvation if you're a believer in a situation like this. But if your idols are around you, your fancy cars or trucks in this area, or all your herds, or all everything that you have, all the money in the bank account, if that's more important to you than whether or not God has his way in your life, God's going to take it all away. But for a reason. He has a plan for your life, and he wants you to follow that plan. Yeah, he'll give you these blessings. I'm not going to argue about that. He'll give you those blessings, but you have to focus on him and give him the glory for it and not let those blessings get in the way. Now, will Jacob figure this out before it's too late? We'll find out next week. Father, we thank you for this time we've had together today. And again, we thank you for the story of this episode of Joseph and how his father's reacting. And it's a sad statement when a person who believes in you won't listen to you. And that's kind of what's happening here. There's a reason why all these things are happening to Jacob and his family. And it's not for bad, it's for good. And when we go through trials and tribulations, it's the same way with us, Father. There's a reason why we are going through all that we go through. It is for your good, Father. And we need to understand that what we have is much more important than what we don't have. What we have is salvation. It doesn't matter if we don't have fame, fortune, fast cars, lifted trucks, things like that. That means nothing. Do we have you in our hearts? And that's the lesson we see here. Because you have a plan for all of us. You want to give us things that we haven't even dreamed of yet. But we have to do your will in order to get it, Father. Because as it says in Jeremiah, you know the thoughts you have toward us, thoughts of good, not of evil, to give us a comfort and a hope. And Father, that's what we're here for. We're here to serve you. We're here to do your will. And most of all, Father, we just want to give you glory. And now, as we close up for today, we ask you to pour a blessing upon our fellowship that follows. Give us all traveling mercies as we head back home today. Give us a beautiful afternoon. Again, we praise you and thank you for the glorious day we have around us. And we give you the glory and honor in Jesus' precious name. Amen.